Good evening for the opportunity given to me to address what I would call as lives in the margin, people who live at the margin and who are subject to social inequality and how it affects their mental health. We are all immersed in seas of inequality. Often stark images like this make us aware of the kind of inequality that surrounds us in our everyday life. How do we acknowledge the inequalities? How do we understand how these inequalities impact mental health, and how do we respond to them? Let me start on a personal note. Through my limited professional forays into the landscape of social inequality. The first such encounter took place when I was a fledgling student in psychiatry. Every month, we used to go to a small village on the outskirts of Bangalore to run a psychiatric camp. During one such visit, there was this elderly gentleman who came and sat in front of me. He was looking quite dull. And over a period of next couple of minutes, he narrated what is happening in his own life. He was a small farmer with a few acres of land in which he was cultivating. In the past 2 to 3 years, due to failure of monsoon, he was not able to really cultivate anything in the fields. And whatever he cultivated failed. During these 3 years, he has also borrowed money from the local money lender for cultivating his land. Now the money lender is after him to repay his money, which he is not able to. So he is in dire economic circumstances, and the entire family is in a tremendous state of emotional distress. He feels overwhelmed by the situation that he is feeling in his life and wonders whether there is any kind of help that could be available for him to overcome this situation, and was feeling extremely hopeless that the situation may not really improve. After listening to him, I walked over to my supervisor, narrated this encounter, and asked him what to do. He advised me, saying that this is a case of depression, prescribe him some antidepressants, which left me wondering whether by subjecting him to therapy in terms of prescription of antidepressants, was I covertly facilitating his adaptation to an unlivable situation instead of enabling him to confront the forces of which he is a victim. To me, his negative cognitions were, in fact, accurate perceptions of a disturbing, deprived life situation. I carry this question even now. Whose cognitive error was it anyway? Was it the cognitive error of this gentleman whose perception of what is happening in his life and whose helplessness and hopelessness were accurate perceptions of his very distressing life situation? Or was it my cognitive error to abstract the suffering and give it a label as depression and prescribe him antidepressant? The second encounter took place much later when I was in the faculty of NIMHANS. One such day when I was taking rounds, the resident said, "Sir, there is a case of conversion disorder." And then we walked over to the intensive care unit and found a young man on the bed, thrashing his limbs violently and shouting. When I examined him, I found a lot of bruises on his back. I sat with him for a while, held his hands, and comforted him. He became a little calmer. Then I walked over to the people who had brought him, and a story emerged. This young man is from a Dalit background who was given away at the age of 6 or 7 to the local landlord as a bonded laborer. This happened because his father had taken loan from the landlord to cultivate his fields, which he was not able to repay. So the landlord told him to send his son to work in his fields so that the wages can be adjusted with the loan. So he was working for more than 10, 15 years as an unpaid laborer with the landlord. One day, he walked over to the landlord expressing a desire to see his parents, whom he had not met for several years. The landlord, for some reason, got extremely angry and thrashed him. As he was hitting him, the young man fell into the ground, shouting and thrashing his legs violently. Unsettled by this, the landlord took him to the local doctor who advised him to take Tunimats. The question is, were his symptoms a consequence of repressed hostility, which then finds expression through convulsions? More importantly, is the locus of repression just within this particular individual? What could be a just approach in such situations to handle the repression within the individual that has found expression through conversion symptoms, or help him to work through his repressive life situation? The third encounter took place in this temple where we had done a small study on temple healing for severe mental illness. In the same temple, on every Friday, there is ritualistic procession. During one such incident, as the musician was playing the drums, a young woman swayed and began to fall into trance. After a few heavy breaths, she danced in a frantic manner, laughing uproariously, talking loudly, sometimes using vulgar epithets. Asked for cigarettes and liquor, which was given. She was hitting out at men who were trying to control her. After about 20 minutes of this, she collapsed on the ground. At the end of it, the priest calmed her down, cut a strand of her hair, wrapped it around a nail, put it in a bottle, covered it, and it was buried outside. We then moved away from the sanctioned social space in which this was occurring and made our way to her home to understand the background for this possession episode. What unraveled was a story of a very disturbed life world of this young girl. This young girl was the bright star of the family, bright star in the school. She was an extremely intelligent girl who did well in all her studies and topped her school final exam. Her dream was to go to the town to pursue her education further and become a doctor. When she expressed it to her parents, the parents felt that there is no need for her to study further and it is time for her to get married to a person chosen by the family who was very much older than her. Not only her dreams of pursuing further education was shattered, she felt very uneasy, unsettled, undistressed about getting married to a man whom she did not have any affection for. On this background, I felt that possession served as an act of symbolic transcendence in which a deeply troublesome psychological distress was expressed through the ideology of spirit possession. I felt basically it was an enactment of an unhappy consciousness. Social and structural inequalities which impose restrictions on the expression of psychological distress also provides space for culturally congruent ways to end emotions. As these three encounters and experiences reflect, psychological distress is experienced, interpreted, and responded to in the context of local worlds in the Indian context. All these three instances are instances of existential inequality, which impact psychological well-being, which is further structured and processed by categories and lenses through a process of othering. Othering such as gender, caste, poverty, or religion. As we are all aware, impoverishment and exploitation economically and emotionally is a subtext of everyday life in our socio-cultural milieu as much as dynamic internal conflicts. Inequality translates into discrimination, fueled by stigma, leading on to disadvantage, limiting access to care. So the most important question when we address the interface between inequality and mental health is, can mental health be operationalized and internalized in isolation of the social fabric, which is often frayed at the edges? How do we move away from the borders of suffering to offer people at the margins, to offer them a sense of belonging? To me, the framework of Amartya Sen offers a viable approach. He outlined what he called as a capability approach, which replaces the view that communities are deficient with a perspective that they are repositories of capabilities and resources that can be engaged. He elaborated this perspective further in a book, An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradiction. And he commented that there is too much of emphasis on generating economic capital and woeful neglect of human and social capital. I personally feel that social capital offers an avenue for us to help and assist those who are in throes of social inequality so that their mental health and well-being is addressed. Social capital emerges from shared norms and beliefs, and therefore it is an ecological characteristic which distinguishes it from social networks and social support, which are properties of individuals. Social capital essentially has two elements, structural and cognitive. Structural refers to networks governed by certain rules and procedures leading to mutually beneficial relationships, whereas the cognitive content refers to value systems that are shared by the members of a society, which influence their relationships. Social capital can facilitate collective action, economic and personal growth, and social development by complementing other forms of social capital. What are the dimensions of social capital? There are principally two dimensions, horizontal and vertical. Horizontal social dimension refers to bonding and bridge. Bonding with people of similar background, crucial for the development of behavioral norms. Bridging with people of dissimilar background, generating broader social identities and reciprocity. Whereas vertical social capital refers to linking with people in different social hierarchies, facilitating access to information and resources outside of immediate social milieu. Higher social capital can facilitate protection from social isolation, can create social safety nets that can buffer emotional crisis, leading on to lower levels of inequality within a society, and finally contributing to the well-being and higher quality of life. So how does social capital impact mental health? Several epidemiological studies, including the classic studies of Harris and Dunham in 1939, Hurlingshed and Redlich in 1958, and Leighton a year later, and that of Brown and Harris 2 decades later, have convincingly demonstrated an intricate relationship between mental health, social structure, social isolation, and inequality. There are several studies which link the social capital to mental health and well-being. Lower levels of social capital contribute to increased incidence of depression. Vulnerability for depression includes unemployment, financial difficulties, lower social status, and lack of confiding relationship. Socially isolated elderly people have a relatively greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, controlling for all other risk factors. And measures of social integration can explain almost 10% of variation in emotional health. There are 4 ways through which social capital can be increased: by strengthening social networks, reinforcing social organizations, consolidating community ties, and contributing to greater involvement of the civil society. In addition, inquiry into social capital can also provide us with insights about protective factors in the community, which enable people living in deprived circumstances to remain in good mental health. So how do we move from social capital to an act of social prescribing, which can expand the boundaries of care in the community? Social prescribing is a mechanism for linking patients in primary care with non-medical sources of support within the community. These include opportunities for volunteering, support groups, befriending, and self-help, as well as access to legal advice. The potential benefits of social prescribing include facilitating better mental health outcome, improving community well-being, and minimizing social exclusion. Unfortunately, there is hardly any study which has examined the linkages between social capital and mental health in the Indian context. This is not very surprising, since our clinical gaze edits out the social suffering, which is a product of the kind of training that happens in the field of mental health, in which there is hardly any input from the humanities, especially from the social sciences. As professionals, we often operate within different universes. If you are going to develop a truly empathic framework, we need to develop an approach that values the notion of parallel truths that emerge from the ground. If we want to listen to the parallel truths, we need to engage with the voice of the subaltern. Unfortunately, the subaltern is often outside the circuit of institutional recognition and validation, and barred from all resources that would address their needs. As mental health professionals, we have to provide space and facilitate expression of what Foucault termed as the fearless speech. Fearless speech is a rough translation of the Greek word parousia, referring to those who take the risk to tell us the truth, even if it differs from what majority of people believe, and face danger for speaking it. So the crucial question is, in the field of mental health, do we really provide them with such spaces to speak and hear their voices? Or do we only hear what makes sense to us based on our own ways of thinking and our particular social contexts? Gayatri Spivak commented very perceptively. Often we speak for them by representing what they say in our own words and for our own purposes. So we need to basically unlearn our intellectual prejudices and theories and prioritize their words, stories, and truths, and not our interpretations of them. I would suggest that there should be a shift in focus in mental health from the archaeology of psyche to the architecture of the unequal socio-cultural landscape, which would involve a critical ethnography of mental health care of the marginalized in the community. One such attempt is what I read recently, a book by Saiba Verma called The Occupied Clinic. Over 60% of population in Kashmir have mental health issues. Many Kashmiris experience what they call kamzori, a persistent fatigue, lack of strength, or loss of energy. Verma argues that kamzori is a manifestation of the way in which violence and colonization became internalized into the bodies of those living under tremendous adversity. She offers a rich ethnography of mental health care in an environment riddled with inadequate resources, inequality, and imposed constraints. Such kind of critical ethnography from the ground can offer very, very rich insights about inequalities and their impact on mental health and well-being. Let me conclude in the words of one of my favorite rock stars, Frank Zappa. Our minds are like parachutes. It doesn't work if it is not open. That is true, especially in the field of inequality and its impact on mental health. Do we know all the answers? Perhaps not. The answers perhaps might emerge after we have asked all the questions. And it is time that we ask all these questions during this important day of the World Mental Health Day. Thank you so much.